Nobody took the giant cowboy seriously. They mocked his slow speech, his clumsy hands, the way he towered over everyone like a misplaced mountain. When she married him, they whispered behind her back, calling it a joke, a mistake, a cry for attention. But the day the river rose and swallowed the town, the laughter stopped. While others ran, he walked straight into the flood, alone, silent, and unstoppable. And only then did they realize who she had truly married. The townsfolk always found a reason to talk, and the sight of a woman like Laura marrying a man like Eli gave them months of material. He stood a full head taller than any man in the valley, his shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, and his hands so large they swallowed coffee mugs like thimbles. Some said he was part ox, others just called him slow, but no one called him friend. Not really. He lived in a wooden cabin just beyond the river bend, where the trees grew thick and the roads turned to dust. He chopped his own wood, raised cattle, and rarely came to town except for supplies. People whispered that he was born under bad stars, that he didn't cry as a baby and hadn't laughed since. None of it was true, but that didn't matter much in a place like this. Laura had grown up in the same town, but walked through it like she didn't belong to it. She had the quiet calm of someone who had spent too many years listening instead of speaking, someone who had learned early that beauty brought attention, and attention brought danger. When she married Eli, folks said it was a pity, a waste, a woman throwing her life away. But Laura didn't care. She saw the way he looked at the world, not with fear or judgment, but with a slow, steady reverence, like everything mattered. She liked the way he fixed fences before they broke, and how he stopped to watch birds lift off in the evening light. He never touched her without her reaching first. He never raised his voice. He never left a thing unfinished. Their wedding was small. Just the preacher, a dusty ring, and the wind as witness. No one stayed after the vows. They rode back to the cabin in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She leaned into him on the saddle, and he adjusted without words, keeping her safe, steady. That night, as the stars came out one by one, they sat outside, watching the sky spill open. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move. That was enough. But the town wouldn't let go. Men laughed over drinks at the saloon, mimicking his slow steps, exaggerating his drawl. Women shook their heads when Laura passed, offering condolences with their eyes. Even children joined in, pointing and giggling when Eli came to town. He bore it all in silence, never reacting. Laura knew it hurt him. She saw the way he paused before stepping into the general store, how his shoulders tensed when someone snickered behind him. But he never said a word. Then came the heat. Weeks without rain. The river ran low and still. The sky turned yellow with dust and tension. Old men spoke of bad signs, but no one prepared. Not really. The earth cracked underfoot, and the cattle grew restless. Something was coming. Eli felt it in his bones. He spent days reinforcing the cabin, stacking sandbags, checking the flow of the river. Laura watched him, her heart tight with worry. He said nothing, but she could tell. Something in him had shifted.
At dawn, the town returned to its usual rhythm. The dry wind dragged dust across the porch rails, and the wooden buildings creaked in the rising heat. The couple's cabin stood apart on the edge of the settlement, not out of choice, but from a quiet agreement no one had spoken aloud. People passed their home without waving. At the general store, whispers lingered like smoke. Every time she walked in, conversations drifted into silence. She would smile anyway, pretend not to notice. But he noticed. He watched from a distance as his wife folded her shoulders smaller each week, like she was learning to disappear. The townspeople didn't insult her directly, but they didn't need to. The stares, the polite refusals, the lack of invitations, they all spoke clearly. It wasn't just because of him. it was because she had chosen him, and that challenged something in their order. The townsfolk called him names behind barn doors and under their breath. Ogre, ox. Some said he wasn't slow, just too dumb to speak. When he hauled logs twice the size of a man, they chuckled and said he was made for labor, not for love. When he stood in silence at the church steps, hat in hand, no one stood beside him. When he carried his wife's groceries with care, the women said she needed protection from him, not the other way around. He didn't speak much. His voice was deep, too heavy, and carried sadness with it. But in the quiet he built. He stacked stones for a new barn, reinforced the foundation of their home, dug ditches no one asked him to. Not because he hoped to be accepted, but because he couldn't help but make things better where he stood. His father had taught him to leave the land stronger than he found it. Each evening he sat with her on their porch. She would talk, he would listen. Sometimes she cried softly, thinking he couldn't hear over the chirping cicadas. But he always heard. Her fingers would trace the rim of her teacup, and he'd shift slightly closer, offering warmth without touching her grief too directly. He didn't have words to fix things, but his presence said what language couldn't. One night, a boy from town crept close to their fence. The couple had just finished dinner when the knock came. Nervous, awkward. The boy stammered something about his dog being stuck in the old ravine, the one where water sometimes ran during spring melt. Without a word, the giant man rose, took a lantern, and followed him. By the time the boy returned home, his dog nestled under one arm and the story into the other, the boy's father didn't believe him. Said the oxman probably scared the mutt into running, but others heard the tale. About how he climbed into the narrowing ravine at dusk, how the earth shifted slightly under his weight, and how he emerged with a trembling dog curled against his chest like a newborn. Still, the town said little. Good deeds didn't erase discomfort, and discomfort often speaks louder than facts. She, however, saw the shift, the way the boy waved when he passed, the way one woman left a jar of preserves on their fence post, with no note, but placed with care. A crack in the wall, small but real. Then came the rain. It started as a steady drizzle, unremarkable, but by morning the dry creek beds had begun to ripple. The clouds hung low and dense, a gray ceiling pressing down on the land. He stood on the ridge early that day, surveying the flow. Years in the wilderness had taught him how rivers behave when they wake up angry. By noon, water clawed through the canyon with a roar. The wooden bridge at the town's edge trembled under its own weight. Horses kicked in their stalls. Mothers shouted for children. And high above it all, the storm swelled in the blackened sky. He moved without waiting for orders. Ropes, boards, sandbags. He waded through water up to his waist, placed himself where no man dared to stand, shoulder braced against a support beam, keeping it from snapping under the weight of the current. A log hit his back, knocking the wind from him. He grunted, but held. That was when people stopped mocking and started watching. They didn't run to help, not yet, but they saw. And sometimes, witnessing is the first step towards changing a heart.
The rain didn't fall, it attacked. Sheets of water slammed against rooftops, tore at shutters, and turned the dusty streets into rivers of filth and fear. The sky had gone black long before nightfall, and the thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, shaking glass and bone alike. Somewhere, a horse screamed and broke loose, galloping through the square, hooves splashing in the rising flood. A woman ran after it, only to fall to her knees in the mud, soaked and sobbing. The town of Dry Valley was drowning, not just in water, but in something heavier, panic. But he was still on the bridge. Half his body now stood submerged. The water, no longer a creek but a torrent, rose to his hips and kept pushing, shoving, clawing at him. Debris struck him over and over, branches, planks, a spinning barrel, but he held. One massive shoulder braced against the main beam, arms wrapped around the support like a man embracing a dying friend. His boots had sunk into the mud, anchoring him, and still he didn't move. The first to arrive was a child. He came stumbling through the rain, barefoot, dragging a coil of rope twice his size. His name was Eli, the blacksmith's apprentice. No one had sent him, no one had followed, but something in the boy said go, and so he went. He waded into the water, trembling, wide-eyed, and offered the rope without words. The giant cowboy nodded, took it with one hand and tied it around the beam, securing it tighter against the current. The boy didn't run. He stayed. Then came old Jack, the man who once called him a freak at the saloon. He didn't speak either, just dropped a box of nails at the edge of the water and held up a hammer, waiting for instructions. None came, but none were needed. Behind him, 3 men arrived, all soaked, all silent. Men who had mocked, laughed, whispered. They now stood ankle-deep in water, gripping boards, ropes, tools. Not heroes, just men trying to make something right. They worked without coordination, without plan, just instinct. One by one, they reinforced what they could, strengthened joints, tied down crossbeams, repositioned sandbags along the bank, all while the flood snarled at their feet. Back on the hill, women and children clustered near the church. The rain had turned the path to sludge, and many slipped as they climbed. He wasn't there to catch them, but they looked down and saw him, the enormous man in the current, still holding, still steady, a shape too big to break. Among them was his wife. She carried a toddler in her arms, not their own, but a stranger's child someone had pushed toward her in desperation. The child's wails pierced the storm, but she didn't flinch. Her shawl was soaked through, hair plastered to her cheeks, but she moved like someone with purpose, not fear. Women around her no longer turned away. They didn't hold her at arm's length. They clutched her hand, leaned into her for warmth, and whispered that it was going to be all right, though no one truly knew. When she reached the top of the hill, she turned and looked back. Her gaze cut through the downpour, searched until it landed on him. There he was, shoulders hunched, fighting for their town when no one had asked him to. And then the worst came. A crash louder than the others, deeper, more final. A section of the far bank gave way. Water exploded through the gap, redirecting straight toward the bridge. The current surged, wild and vengeful. And in that moment, everyone saw it. The bridge would not hold. He felt it too. The pressure doubled, then tripled. His feet shifted. A jolt of pain shot through his back, the same place where the log had struck him earlier. His knees buckled slightly, and the others, the men beside him, they froze. Because if he fell, the rest would mean nothing. The bridge would go, the town would follow. But he didn't fall. With a growl that came from somewhere deep, he forced himself upright again, fingers digging into the wet timber. His breath came in bursts now, ragged and sharp, but he didn't let go. Someone shouted behind him, a woman's voice sharp with fear. Another man cursed, and yet another ran to fetch more boards. But in the center of it all, he remained still, a lone pillar of will, the giant, the outcast, the man no one wanted till the storm came. And that was when they began to change. Not in a single sweeping gesture, but in small, telling ways. A man who once crossed the street to avoid him now threw a rope around his own waist and stepped into the current. A teenager who had laughed behind his back now handed nails with shaking hands. A storekeeper who had never met his gaze now held a lantern high, shielding it from the rain. The town, bit by bit, began to fight alongside him.
The wind changed. It didn't stop, it shifted, turned colder, sharper, howling through alleyways and around corners like it was searching for something to tear apart. Rain slanted sideways now, stinging the eyes, driving nails of water into skin and wood alike. Trees bent, shingles flew, lanterns went out, one by one, until the only light was the flickering torch someone jammed into the bridge railing and shielded with their coat. But the man at the center of the storm didn't blink. His knuckles had gone pale from strain. His skin, blistered and raw, clung to soaked fabric. Every breath rattled in his chest, but he held. One shoulder pressed to the splintering beam, one hand clenched around a rope fraying at the edges. His hat had long been swept away, and blood mixed with rain on his temple, but he stood like a monument to defiance, silent, immovable, entirely alone in the violence of the elements. Until he wasn't. One by one they returned, not just men with rope, women too, hauling sandbags, dragging barrels, clutching children to their sides while handing off tools. Even those who had once said she should have married someone else, the butcher's wife, the mayor's cousin, the school teacher with her hem soaked to the knees. No one gave orders, no one asked why they were helping. They just were. And he noticed none of it. Not really. He only saw one thing. The bridge was failing. Hairline cracks had appeared in the support columns. The water rose inch by inch, chewing at the foundation. The ropes they had secured were now tugging against swollen wood, some already snapping, their ends curling like whips. It wouldn't be long now. Behind him, someone shouted for the horses to be moved uphill. Another voice, older and broken, cried that a child was missing. The chaos returned, but he didn't move. And then came the scream. It tore through the storm like glass through silence, high, sharp, and close. He turned. A girl, maybe 8, maybe younger, clung to the far side of the bridge, her arms wrapped around a broken fence post that barely held to the decking, her hair plastered to her face, her legs dangling above the rushing flood. No one knew how she'd gotten there. Maybe she'd slipped away from the church, chasing something. Maybe she'd been forgotten in the panic. But there she was, alone, and screaming. Time didn't pause, it snapped. Before anyone else could move, he did. He let go of the support beam, the one he had held for hours, the one his own weight had braced. As he stepped away, a collective breath caught in the town's throat. The current seized the loosened structure and gave a groan like some old god waking. Boards shifted, nails shrieked, but he was already on the move. Through the water, across the trembling boards, toward the girl. The bridge swayed beneath his feet, groaning under pressure. A gap opened near his heel, wide enough to swallow a leg. He stepped over it, then another. A snapped beam cracked upward, trying to spear the sky. Still he went forward. The girl sobbed harder now, her small hands bleeding from splinters. And then, at last, he reached her. With one arm, he scooped her up, pressing her to his chest like she was weightless. With the other, he turned back. And in that moment, as the sky flared with lightning and the whole town stared from the hillside, the bridge let go. A final snap. The far end collapsed, torn from its moorings. Water surged over it like a beast freed from chains. The weight of it buckled the center, right where he stood. But he didn't fall. With a roar, not from pain, but from pure will, he leapt. A man of impossible size, carrying a child half drowned toward the safe side. Boards cracked behind him as he landed, knees buckling, breath gone, child still in his arms. The girl sobbed into his neck. The crowd, stunned, didn't move. And then, someone dropped to their knees. It was the pastor's wife, the one who once called him unnatural. She knelt in the mud, head bowed. And then another did. And then another. Not out of worship, but in awe. The woman he loved pushed through the crowd, skirts dragging through the water, hands trembling. She didn't cry this time. She didn't speak. She only touched his cheek, muddy, bleeding, and looked at him like he had become the very center of her world. The child in his arms stirred, and finally, someone said it. God sent him. Not everyone agreed, but no one argued.
By morning, the rain had stopped. The wind quieted, clouds thinned to mist,
and for the first time in 3 days, the sun broke through the eastern ridge, hesitant, pale, but real. It cast golden light across the soaked earth, glinting off puddles like shards of glass. Chickens wandered from their coops, dogs barked cautiously, and the townspeople stood still, gathered near what remained of the bridge, watching the empty gap like it was a grave. The flood had passed, but something else had been washed away too. The giant cowboy stood at the edge of the riverbank, his shirt torn, his boots caked in dried mud, a crust of blood still smeared across his brow. He didn't speak. He never did. The child he'd carried had been taken home, wrapped in wool and kissed by a mother who couldn't stop crying. No one needed to ask who had saved her. They'd all seen it, and no one forgot. Not this time. He glanced down at the space where the bridge had been. Nothing remained but broken beams and swirling silt. His hands ached. His knees trembled when he shifted weight, but he stayed standing. Behind him, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. He didn't turn, but he knew who it was. She stepped beside him, not behind, beside. Her hand found his, fingers cold but certain. She didn't look at the wreckage. She looked at him. And this time, everyone else did too. The townspeople stood in a loose, quiet semicircle. No one clapped, no cheers, just silence, the kind that means respect. Some wore expressions twisted by guilt, others awe, but all of them, every last one, finally saw the man they'd refused to see for so long. They had mocked him for being large, for being slow, for being too quiet. But none of them had stepped into that water. None of them had held back a river.
The mayor stepped forward first, hat in hand, eyes down. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, a gesture of apology, of thanks, of something heavier. The others followed, storekeepers, ranchers, mothers, boys who once spat near his boots. Even old Jack, who once called him the dumb ox, took off his hat and stood bareheaded in the morning light. And still, the man said nothing. He didn't need to, because what words could hold the weight of what he'd done? A few men began moving toward the wreckage, inspecting what could be salvaged. Talk turned to rebuilding, stronger beams, new stone pilings, maybe even a name carved into the planks. She spoke first. "We'll help," she said. Not he, we, and no one questioned it. He turned slightly, eyes meeting hers, not surprised, not questioning, just steady. She smiled, not the polite, forced smile she used to give around town, but something true, something that said, "They see now, but I always did." Weeks passed. The bridge was rebuilt, wider, higher, meant to last. And when it came time to place the final board across the center, no one argued about the name burned into the rail, for the one who held. He didn't attend the unveiling. He was up the hill, repairing the damaged roof of the church barn. He never liked attention, never needed it. But word spread. Travelers stopped to ask, "Who was it?" they'd say. "Who's the man in the stories?" And someone would always answer, "You'll know him when you see him." Because you couldn't forget a man like that. Not because of his size, but because of the silence he filled with strength. Because when the flood came, and everything began to break, he was the one who held.